In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to add motion blur to your animations to make your animations much more realistic. So here is a simple animation with no motion blur, and if I go really slow here, you'll see the graphic is really sharp from beginning to end, so there is no motion blur on this one. And now if we look at the same animation with motion blur added, it's very subtle, but the blur gives it a sense of movement. If I drag through the animation really slowly, you can see the animation's got this blur on it that gives it a sense of movement, and as the animation ends, everything gets sharper. To add motion blur, first select the layer that you want to add motion blur to. Then you're going to check on this box right here. It's under this column here with the 3 circles. If you do not see this column, just click on this right here, toggle switches and modes. So if you're only seeing this, click on this, and you should see the motion blur column. Just click in the box, and if I press and hold, you will see it says motion blur at the very top. When I let go, that just added motion blur to the entire layer. To add motion blur to any other layer that has movement, all you have to do is click in the box under the motion blur column. So just click in there, and that is adding motion blur to each of these layers. And to toggle on and toggle off motion blur for the entire composition, you're going to use this icon that sits at the very top. You'll see it's the same exact icon, but this one at the top. This controls the motion blur for the entire composition. So while it's blue, motion blur is turned on for all the layers. If you click it, it's going to turn it off for all the layers. So you can preview it, or you can export it with or without the motion blur turned on by using this master control switch for the motion blur. If you ever want to turn off motion blur for any layer, just click on it again, and that will remove motion blur. And if you ever want to fine-tune your motion blur and get more advanced, just go to the composition menu, choose composition settings, or use the keyboard shortcut command K. Click on advanced, and this section right here, this controls motion blur, so you can play with these settings to fine-tune your motion blur. So I now have motion blur on all of my layers with movement. If you do not see the motion blur column, just click on this button down here, toggle switches and modes, and then you will see the motion blur column. With this blue, that means motion blur is engaged for the entire composition, and if I drag the playhead slow, you will see as the animations come in, it's got that subtle motion blur, giving a nice realistic effect, and when it stops, it gets nice and sharp, just adds a nice touch to your animations.